So the name of my channel is, of course, Oddball Camera, and I picked that word oddball on purpose. That wasn't an accident. What are some other words that come to mind? Well, weird, misfit, unique, offbeat, remarkable, eccentric, peculiar. All of these words have that oddball meaning to me, and I'm going to focus on these three in particular: quirky, unique, and remarkable. And the camera that I'm going to be talking about today certainly falls into all three of these categories as a definition for oddball camera. Now, Alpa as a company pretty much falls into this category no matter which camera you're talking about. Virtually all their cameras were certainly quirky, unique, and remarkable in different ways. However, the Alpa Model 7 camera that I'm going to be talking about today is certainly among the quirkiest cameras ever built. It's also a very unique camera in a number of ways that I'll get into. And its story and the story of Alpa in general is a very remarkable story. So by my estimation, this camera is probably one of the most oddball cameras in my collection. Well, the camera I'm going to be talking about in today's video is a camera that I have been looking forward to talking about for quite a while. It's probably one of my favorite cameras in my collection. It's a camera that was on my wish list for a very long time. It took me quite a number of years to locate an example that was reasonably priced and in good condition. And I finally tracked one down a few years ago, and I'm very excited to have it and to talk to you about it today. It's a camera that is definitely an oddball camera, and no matter how you define that word, oddball, this camera definitely qualifies. It's very quirky, it's very unusual, it's somewhat rare, there's not a lot of them out there. It's a very high quality camera, and a camera that maybe some of you haven't even heard of before. And the camera is this camera right here. This is an Alpa Model 7. The Alpa Model 7 was first introduced in 1952, and it was part of Alpa's second generation of cameras. So in 1952 they introduced the Model 4, the Model 5, and the Model 7. And then a few years later introduced the Model 6 and the Model 8. The Model 7, which is the one I tracked down, was the model that I was most interested in locating. This particular example I've dated to 1954. Okay, so let's talk about what makes this camera so unique or unusual. Well, it's impossible to talk about this camera without talking about one of the most unusual aspects of the camera, which is it is a single lens reflex camera with an integrated prism. And actually the original Alpas, the previous generation, were among the first cameras in the world to have an integrated prism with a single lens reflex system. But what makes this really unusual is it is both a single lens reflex camera with integrated prism as well as also being a rangefinder camera. So it provides both the rangefinder and the single lens reflex with prism system. Very unusual. And then if that wasn't enough, to make it even more unusual, the rangefinder system is actually a vertical rangefinder. So the secondary window for the rangefinder is down here and supplements the viewfinder portion of the rangefinder up here in the normal position to provide a vertical separating image for the rangefinder image rather than the traditional horizontal where you would typically have the secondary window over here on the other side. And if that wasn't enough, the viewfinder of the rangefinder system also has a built-in variable viewfinder field of view, and it provides you with three different options: one for 50mm lenses, one for 90mm lenses, and one for 135mm lenses. This is extremely unusual to have this integrated into the camera. Normally you only find variable focal length finders in external rangefinders and viewfinders, so that's very unusual. Now coming back to the front of the camera, this isn't extremely unusual, but it is uncommon to have the shutter release button on the front of the camera. Alpa did this on purpose, and their claim was that locating the shutter release on the front of the camera provides better stability for when you're releasing the shutter. The camera also includes a self-timer, which is not unusual, but what makes this one a little bit unique is that you can adjust the duration of the self-timer to your liking, anywhere from 1 second up to, I believe, 12 seconds. Then when you start getting into the details of the design, you start seeing some rather strange features. For instance, this camera can synchronize with both flash bulbs and electronic flash. Typically, you will see either 2 separate ports or a single port with a switch that allows you to switch between flash bulbs and electronic flash. This camera uses 2 separate ports, but rather than having them side by side, they have one forward-facing port down here below the lens and a second port up here sideways facing next to the lens. Now, it is a 35mm camera. It is designed to take standard 35mm cartridges. The camera can also be set up to transport 35mm film from one open spool to another open spool, a little bit unusual for the 1950s. And then lastly, it's actually designed to also accept AGFA rapid cassettes. Very unusual for a camera to be designed to take either 35mm standard cassettes or AGFA rapid cassettes. Now, this particular camera, being from the earlier years of the production run, would have come with a rewind knob that permits the use of AGFA rapid cassettes. However, someone has replaced this with a later model rewind knob at some point in this camera's life. And this style is also somewhat unusual in that it is a ratcheting rewind knob. So you pull the rewind knob up and it will actually ratchet rather than you having to spin it continuously. Now, certainly Pignon's experience producing parts for watchmaking supplies most likely contributed to their design for the ratcheting rewind knob. It is quite handy, I will say. Now, as we move around to the back, one other unusual feature to note here, here is the viewfinder for the prism system, and you can see the viewfinder and the prism are set at a 45-degree angle. So you look in at 45 degrees. You can see the view portal for the combination viewfinder rangefinder is over here on the left. Now, the camera is a very high quality feeling camera, and as it should be. For the time, it was considered something of a luxury item, and still feels that way today. I will say this is one of the smoothest winding cameras I've ever used of any era. The film winding knob is a very short throw. It's about 160 degrees. So you simply twist this knob by 160 degrees. It's very easy to do. It's very, very smooth, just like winding a high-quality watch, as you would probably expect. Now, the other interesting thing is this camera is designed to allow intermediate shutter speeds. So you can see there are marked shutter speeds from 1 second all the way up to 1,000th of a second. But by design, you can actually set the shutter speed indicator anywhere you want in that range, and it will fire the shutter at the intermediate speed that you've selected. Now, obviously, the intermediate speeds are not marked, so you're somewhat guessing, but you can, in fact, shoot this at any speed between any of the marked speeds as well. With one unusual exception. You'll note here the bulb mode for the camera. You probably can't see that very well, but it's right here in the middle of the shutter speed range rather than at one end or the other like you typically would see. So it lies between 1/10 of a second and 1/25 of a second. And that is the only section of the shutter speed range in which you cannot select an intermediate shutter speed. So you can select intermediate shutter speeds between 1/25 of a second and 1/1000th of a second, or between 1 second and 1/10 of a second. But between 1/10 and 1/25 of a second, your only option is the B, or bulb mode. I suspect that's because the slow speed system is on a separate system from the higher speed system. Now, the camera was originally supplied with a wide range of different but very high quality standard lenses. I have the desirable Cairn Switar 1.8 50mm lens. This lens, made by Cairn, was also made in Switzerland along with the camera itself. Originally, the camera could also be supplied with lenses from Ingenue in France or Old Delft out of Holland, and also could be supplied with standard lenses from Schneider from Germany or from Kilfit even from Germany as well. Now, in any discussion about an Alpa camera, it's impossible to not talk about Yakov Bogopolsky. Yakov was born in 1895 in Kiev, in what is now Ukraine, but was part of the Russian Federation at the time. In around 1914, he emigrated from Kiev to Geneva, Switzerland, at the age of around 18, to study at the University of Geneva. Once he arrived in Switzerland, he quickly started going by the name of Jacques Bolsey or Bolsey, the first of many name changes that he would undergo in his life. And this move would end up being somewhat fortuitous for him, but also would spell the end of his long-term family connections. Once World War I broke out, followed by the Russian Revolution, Yakov was essentially cut off from his family and was not able to return to Russia, and actually lost a brother to the purges of Stalin during this time. Now, during his time in Switzerland, it quickly became apparent that Jacques was something of a mechanical genius, particularly where cameras were involved. He also had a great affinity and interest in developing movie cameras in particular, and in the 1920s, he developed a very early, very high-end 16mm movie camera, which eventually morphed into the Bolex camera. He sold the rights to build the camera to the Swiss firm Payard, and of course the rest is history there. The Payard Bolex became one of the most famous and most well-used advanced amateur or semi-professional movie cameras ever made. Now, following the success of his movie camera, Bolsey went on to start the development of a high-quality 35mm stills camera. And he started that work in the mid-1930s, and after a few years had a working prototype which he called the Bolka Reflex. And then similarly to what he did with his movie camera, he ended up selling the rights to produce the camera to a Swiss manufacturer, and in this case the Swiss manufacturer was Pignons. And Pignons was a manufacturer of parts for high-end watch manufacturer. Of course, Swiss watch manufacturer was famous even back at that time, and so they had a great deal of expertise in producing high-quality gearing and escapements and everything that would be needed for a high-quality 35mm camera. Now, in 1939, just as World War II was getting underway, Jacques Bolsey made another big move in his life, and another very fortuitous move. He decided to emigrate from Switzerland to the United States and basically escaped Europe just in time. He is of Jewish descent, and many of his family members were unfortunately caught in the Nazi regime and were killed as part of the Holocaust. Jacques was able to escape and move to the United States, and once again changed his name now to Jacques Bolsey. Once in the United States, Jacques Bolsey wasted no time in getting started on his next project, which was to establish his own camera company for the first time. The Bolsey Camera Company made some very interesting cameras through the 1950s, including some fairly small cameras and some pretty advanced cameras. Jacques Bolsey intentionally made cameras that he wanted to be affordable to the general population, but still have unique and professional features associated with them. Okay, well, final thoughts on this camera and then I'll wrap it up. As expected, the camera feels like a very high quality camera. It's hard to believe it's 70 years old in some ways. All the operating controls are incredibly smooth, a little quirky, and they do take a little getting used to. But the optics of the Cairn lens certainly live up to the hype. Honestly, I was kind of blown away by how sharp this lens is, considering it's 70 years old. It's even sharper than I would have ever expected it to be. I definitely will take this camera out and shoot again. It's quite a bit of fun to shoot with. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more to come.